Prepare yourself for a dark journey through history, where power and ambition gave birth to a reign of destruction. 3 queens, marked by their relentless wickedness, defied the will of God and left a trail of chaos and blood in their wake. Are you ready to uncover how evil can dominate a heart, and how divine justice always finds its way? Picture yourself transported to a distant era, ancient times when kings and queens ruled not just with golden scepters but with iron hands, intrigue, and sometimes with a malice that transcends generations. Today, we dive into a dark chapter of biblical history, where 3 queens stood out not for their goodness or wisdom but for their wicked actions, hardened hearts, and alliances with evil. These women, Jezebel, Athaliah, and Herodias, are not just distant figures on dusty scrolls, they embody the cruelest, most manipulative side of power. Their stories, intertwined with blood, betrayal, and an unquenchable thirst for control, echo through the pages of the Bible as eternal warnings. Let us discover who these queens were, remembered not for what they built but for what they destroyed. Each of them, in her own way, turned their kingdoms into stages for atrocities and idolatries, responsible for countless deaths and the spiritual corruption of entire nations. Prepare for a journey through realms devastated by vanity, thirst for power, and a malice that seems endless. This is the story of the 3 most wicked queens in the Bible. A narrative of terror and unchecked ambition, where power in the wrong hands can turn the world into a desolate wasteland. And the question remains, how far can a human go to satisfy their insatiable desire for control? We turn now to the first of these dark figures, Jezebel. Daughter of a Phoenician king, raised amidst pagan rituals and cruel deities, she was not born in Israel but brought there through an arranged marriage, a political alliance between nations. Her fate became entwined with Ahab, the king of Israel, a weak man easily manipulated, and Jezebel saw in this a great opportunity. Upon her arrival, she exerted her influence over the kingdom. But Jezebel was not an ordinary queen. Instead of adopting the traditions of the people she now ruled, she brought something far more sinister. Like a slow poison, she introduced the worship of Baal, a pagan god of cruel sacrifices, and transformed the heart of Israel. What once was a nation devoted to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob began to bow before idols carved from stone and wood. Jezebel, with her seductive beauty and manipulative mind, did more than influence Ahab, she dominated the kingdom. She ordered the deaths of God's prophets as if it were a mere whim, and anyone who dared oppose her will met a tragic fate. Her name was whispered with fear, as if invoking her presence would bring ruin. Every step she took seemed calculated to destroy all that was sacred. As altars to Baal were erected, the ashes of true faith scattered in the wind. Jezebel was not content to be merely a wife or consort, she sought to be the true force shaping Israel's destiny, at any cost. And the price was paid in blood. Jezebel, in her dark rise, proved to be ruthless. It wasn't enough for her simply to rule, her desire for power transcended politics and reached the depths of the human spirit. She began to destroy everything holy in Israel, and any voice raised against her wicked acts was immediately silenced. Her enemies, especially the prophets of God, knew their lives were constantly at risk. In this context, one of the most dramatic figures of her story emerged, Naboth, a simple man, owner of a vineyard that, to anyone else, would have been a modest property. But to Jezebel, that vineyard became a symbol. When Ahab desired the land and Naboth, faithful to God's laws, refused to sell it, Jezebel saw an opportunity. Not to satisfy her husband's childish desires, but to once again demonstrate her absolute power. With calculated coldness, she set a trap. False accusations were made against Naboth, accusing him of blasphemy against God and the king, a cruel irony coming from a woman who respected nothing sacred. A forged trial was held, and Naboth, an innocent man, was stoned to death. And so, Jezebel took the vineyard for her husband as though it were a trivial conquest. But this was not an isolated act. It was the pinnacle of her blatant wickedness, a demonstration that, in her twisted world, the blood of a righteous man was no more valuable than the land he owned. Jezebel didn't just rule with cruelty, she obliterated any trace of goodness, without remorse or hesitation. The people, once God-fearing, watched in horror as this woman seized absolute control, like a shadow darkening everything around her. She seemed invincible, untouchable, a force no human could confront. But divine justice was approaching, even though Jezebel, in her arrogance, had yet to realize the price she would pay. But fate, relentless, always waits for the right moment to demand its dues. Jezebel, blind in her thirst for power, believed herself untouchable. She manipulated the nation like an invisible puppeteer, controlling the king and spreading fear across every corner of Israel. Yet there was a force she could not foresee, a force that does not bow before kings or queens, that does not fear thrones or palaces, the prophet Elijah, the man of God. Elijah, in his righteous fury, challenged Jezebel in a way no one had dared before. He rose against her pagan gods, against her tyranny, and brought forth the word of the Lord with a power that shook the earth. Their confrontation culminated on Mount Carmel, where Jezebel, determined to prove her God superior, encouraged a deadly challenge. The prophets of Baal gathered in multitudes, believing they could summon their gods to defeat Elijah and shame the God of Israel. The stage was set, on one side, Elijah, alone, a faithful prophet against a powerful queen and her 450 prophets of Baal. Jezebel, watching from afar, anticipated seeing Elijah humiliated, hoping her gods would answer the desperate cries of their followers. But the heavens remained silent. There was no response to the pleas to Baal, no fire, no miracle. Elijah, filled with confidence in the living God, called upon the Lord, and fire descended from the sky in a spectacle that consumed not only the sacrifice but also Jezebel's hopes of proving her power. The defeat was crushing. The prophets of Baal were destroyed, and for a brief moment, justice seemed to prevail. But Jezebel was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. Enraged, she swore vengeance. She sent a message to Elijah, vowing to kill him just as he had done to her prophets. Her wrath was like an imminent storm, relentless, and her wounded pride made her even more dangerous. The kingdom trembled in fear of her rage, and Elijah, even as a powerful prophet, was forced to flee for his life. Jezebel's end, however, was already written. The prophet, speaking with the voice of God, had declared her fate: she would be devoured by dogs in the fields of Jezreel, without the dignity of a royal burial. The queen who once ruled with tyranny, surrounded by luxuries and adoration, would not escape divine justice. And though she still reveled in her throne, the shadow of her ruin was already silently following her, ready to consume her at the right moment. And so, Jezebel's fate loomed like a dark shadow over the kingdom. But the story didn't end there. From the ruins of her wickedness, another figure would emerge to continue the cycle of terror and destruction: her own daughter, Athaliah. Raised in the shadow of her mother's darkness, Athaliah learned early that power belonged only to those willing to stain their hands with blood. Athaliah, unlike her mother, didn't need to conquer a king. She herself seized the throne of Judah after her son's death, and her ascent to power was marked by an unprecedented act of brutality. Determined to secure her absolute rule, she ordered the massacre of the entire royal line of David. Yes, the entire line. Men, women, children, no one was safe from her thirst for power. The blood running through her veins, Jezebel's blood, seemed to pulse with even more ferocity. Imagine the horror that spread throughout Judah. The people, used to seeing David's lineage as the living promise of God's covenant, now found themselves under a queen who not only seized power by force but also sought to extinguish any hope of redemption. Athaliah, with her hardened heart, wanted to eradicate any trace of the divine promise, any threat that could take the throne she had so bloodily secured. For 6 years, Athaliah ruled with an iron fist. Her cold eyes watched every move, and any whisper against her reign was treated as treason. Fear reigned, just as she did. But Athaliah wasn't merely a queen ruling through terror, she also brought with her her mother's dark legacy. The worship of pagan gods flourished under her reign, altars to Baal once again rose as monuments of disobedience to the sacred covenant Judah had with God. But, as in Jezebel's case, evil never goes unanswered. The line of David, which Athaliah believed she had eradicated, still had one final spark. Hidden in the temple's shadows, a single heir, the young Joash, was protected by faithful priests. For all those years of tyranny, Athaliah ruled unaware that the true royal line still lived, like a spark waiting for the right moment to reignite the flame of David's throne. And so, once again, fate conspired against a queen who believed herself invincible. The cycle of wickedness that Athaliah had inherited from Jezebel was about to be broken, and the justice she had so long evaded was drawing near, invisible but inevitable. For 6 long years, Athaliah ruled Judah like a shadow over the light. Her presence was suffocating, and fear seemed to have become woven into the fabric of the kingdom. Each of her gestures reaffirmed the power she had secured with blood, as if the throne were an extension of her own corrupt soul. The temple had been defiled, altars to Baal flourished, and the nation that had once been chosen by God sank deeper into the darkness of idolatry and tyranny. Athaliah, now accustomed to power, believed herself unshakable. Each act of cruelty seemed only to reinforce her sense of security on the throne. She ruled with an iron hand, crushing any real or imagined threat, and the people, desperate and without hope, barely dared to dream of a new era. But in the shadows, the conspiracy began to take shape. The young Joash, the rightful heir of David's line, had been hidden in the temple, protected by the priest Jehoiada and his wife Jehosheba. They knew that Athaliah's time was numbered, that the true king of Judah, though only a child, was destined to restore divine order. While Athaliah remained blind with arrogance and pride, the priest Jehoiada secretly gathered the military leaders, priests, and Levites. In secret, they plotted a revolt, knowing that only a decisive strike could end the tyrant's reign. Every move was calculated with precision, one mistake, and all would be lost. Then, the day arrived. The temple, which had been a place of concealment for Joash, now became the stage for his ascent. Jehoiada, with courage and wisdom, presented the young heir to the nation. In an act of deep reverence and courage, he crowned Joash as king, there in the house of God. The people, who had long lived under Athaliah's yoke, responded with cries of joy and hope. The light that had been extinguished for so long now burned again. Athaliah, hearing the sounds of acclamation and celebration in the temple, rushed to investigate, unaware that her reign was nearing its end. Upon entering and seeing the crowd proclaiming Joash as king, she realized in a moment of shock and fury that her power had slipped through her fingers. In despair, she tore her garments and screamed, "Treason! Treason!" But it was too late. The conspiracy had succeeded, and the people, tired of her reign of terror, would not defend her. Athaliah was dragged from the temple, far from the sacred place, and there, at the palace gates, met her end, just as her mother Jezebel, before the divine justice she could not escape. Athaliah's tyranny had ended, and with it, an era of darkness began to lift. Joash, the rightful heir, was finally on the throne, and David's line, preserved by divine plan, would continue. Once again, light triumphed over shadow, and God's justice prevailed, relentless and inescapable. And so, with Athaliah's blood spilled outside the temple's walls, Judah could breathe again. The reign of terror and darkness was finally over, and Joash, still a child, was placed on the throne. The people, with tears of relief, began to glimpse a future where justice and true faith could be restored. The priest Jehoiada, faithful to the end, would guide the young king in his early years, helping him rebuild what had been devastated by tyranny. Athaliah's death brought with it a renewal of the covenant between the people and God. The altars to Baal, erected with such pride by that dark queen, were destroyed. The stones that once supported false gods now lay broken on the ground, and the temple of God, which had been defiled, began to be purified. The echoes of celebratory hymns spread through the streets of Jerusalem, and the people, who had long lived in fear, now walked with heads held high, feeling the breeze of freedom for the first time in years. Yet the scars of Athaliah's reign would not fade easily. The innocent blood she spilled, the members of David's line she sought to eradicate, these scars would remain forever etched in Judah's memory. But there was renewed hope that the covenant between God and his people could be restored and that David's throne would continue to stand, supported by the divine promise. However, as Judah sought to heal, in a distant land, another queen watched closely, silently plotting. Herodias, the third and final figure of this wicked trio, was about to step onto the stage of history. And though her wickedness differed from that of Jezebel and Athaliah, it would be no less devastating. Herodias did not seek the throne of a kingdom but perhaps something even darker, personal vengeance. Her wrath knew no boundaries, and her ambition was rooted in an insatiable thirst to destroy anyone who dared cross her path. While the people of Judah celebrated the restoration of their kingdom, another cycle of pain and destruction was beginning to unfold in Herod's lands. Herodias, with her twisted mind and hardened heart, would be remembered not just for her lust for power but for her willingness to sacrifice what was most sacred to achieve her goals. She was about to become the shadow that threatened God's prophets, sealing the fate of one of the greatest servants who ever walked the earth. The time for her vengeance was drawing near, and the world would soon see how a queen, even without a crown, could poison everything around her with her malignancy. The story was far from over. The cycle of pain would still unfold, but fate was already beginning to move towards Herodias. Now, our gaze turns to the figure of Herodias, a woman enveloped in family plots as venomous as her own soul. Herodias wasn't a queen in the traditional sense, but her power, her influence, was as deadly as that of Jezebel and Athaliah. Married to Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee, she used her charm and manipulation to rule from the shadows, pulling the strings of a weak and unstable man. However, what set her apart from her predecessors was that Herodias did not merely crave political power or dominion over a kingdom. She had a more personal, more visceral target, and that target was John the Baptist. John the Baptist, the prophet who cried out in the wilderness, whose voice echoed with the authority of God, became a direct threat to Herodias's way of life. He didn't just denounce sin, he dared to point his finger directly at her, condemning her incestuous marriage to Herod, for Herodias had previously been married to his brother, Philip. Herodias's wounded pride, combined with the shame of being exposed, fueled her thirst for revenge. But Herodias did not act immediately. She waited. Her hatred grew with every word from John the Baptist, each time he dared to raise his voice against her and her husband. Herodias knew John had influence over the people, that many regarded him as a holy man, and this only made her wrath even more unbearable. She wanted his head, and nothing less than that would satisfy her. And so, Herodias devised her plan with the precision of a spider weaving its web. She waited for the perfect moment, a moment when she could not only exact her revenge but also humiliate her enemy before all. That moment came during a grand feast, a celebration held by Herod in honor of his nobles and officers. At the height of the festivity, with wine flowing and senses dulled, Herodias sent her daughter, Salome, onto the scene. The young girl danced with a seductive grace that captivated all the eyes present, especially those of Herod. Enchanted by Salome's dance, Herod, in a fit of vanity and desire, offered the young girl anything she asked for, even half of my kingdom, he proclaimed. This was exactly what Herodias had been waiting for. With a poisonous whisper in her daughter's ear, she told her what to ask for. And Salome, without hesitation, approached Herod and, with a sweet voice, made her fatal request, "I want, right now, the head of John the Baptist on a platter." The hall fell into a terrible silence. Herod, caught in his own trap of pride, hesitated. He knew John was a just man, feared and revered by the people. But his fear of losing the respect of his guests, his desperate need to maintain his authority before them, outweighed his conscience. And so, with a heavy nod, he gave the order. Shortly after, the head of John the Baptist was brought, bloodied, on a silver platter. Herodias, gazing upon the prize she had long desired, finally tasted the bitter fruit of her revenge. But as is often the case, the victory she had longed for brought no relief. It only perpetuated the darkness within her heart. John was dead, but his message, his light, could never be extinguished. Herodias, in her lust for power and revenge, had sealed her name in history, not as a grand queen, but as a tragic figure, poisoned by her own hatred. Once again, evil had triumphed momentarily, but fate, as always, would exact its price. And so, with the applause still echoing through the palace halls and the taste of revenge burning in the applause still echoing through the palace halls and the taste of revenge burning in the back of her throat, Herodias found herself alone. The head of John the Baptist, brought before her on a silver platter, should have been the pinnacle of her satisfaction, the moment when all her internal torments would dissipate. But what she found there, in the empty gaze of the decapitated prophet, was not peace, nor relief, but a deeper emptiness. The feast continued around her, the guests laughing and dancing, but Herodias hardly noticed them. The sound of laughter felt distant, like an echo from another world. She was engulfed in her own darkness. What had she truly accomplished? What remained of her hatred now that John was dead? His body had been silenced, yes, but his voice still echoed. John's message, his harsh and truthful words, now seemed louder than ever, resonating in her mind like an indelible memory, a sentence from which she could never escape. Salome, her daughter, whom she had used as a pawn in her wicked game, returned to her side, but Herodias barely recognized her. The glow of victory in her eyes quickly faded. The void that John the Baptist left by being silenced began to consume everything around her. And Herod, who had yielded to that terrible request, also felt the chains of remorse tightening around his heart. Even he, a weak and susceptible man, seemed to understand in a twisted way that something irreparable had been done that night. John the Baptist, the prophet who had cried out in the wilderness, preparing the way for the Messiah, was now dead. But the message he carried could not be buried with him. John's words spread like the wind, touching the souls of the people, who knew that his death had been unjust, orchestrated by the vanity and hatred of a woman thirsty for revenge. Herodias could not escape the truth. Deep down, she knew that by killing John, she had not destroyed the spirit he carried. On the contrary, she had only given more strength to his message. The death of John the Baptist marked a turning point, an eternal reminder that while evil may triumph for a moment, it can never completely extinguish the light of truth. And so, while John's body was taken away, Herodias found herself imprisoned not in a cell of stone but in one of her own making, a cell of late regret and silent remorse. She had won, yes, but the victory was bitter, like poison. John was dead, but his words, his prophecies, and the light he had brought to the world would never die. Herodias would live the rest of her days with that burden. Her thirst for revenge had not only destroyed her enemy but also consumed her, leaving her as nothing more than a shadow of herself. Just like Jezebel and Athaliah before her, Herodias learned the hard way that power and revenge are flames that, once lit, consume everything, even the one who carries them. And as she retreated into the darkness of her chambers, the world around her continued to move forward, but Herodias would never be the same. She had become part of a story that would live on forever, not as a queen of glory but as a woman remembered for her hatred and the destruction she caused. John the Baptist's name would echo through the ages, while Herodias's name would become a symbol of tragedy, an eternal warning about what happens when evil takes hold of the human heart.